They told me to ask nicely if I wanted a blanket. Those words still echo in my mind as if they were a slap, sharp and cold, like the winter nights I had to endure afterward. It wasn't just the chill of the air that seeped into my bones, but the freezing indifference in my son's voice when he said it, standing there with his arms crossed, watching me as if I were some unwanted guest in his home, rather than the mother who had raised him. I was 81 years old then, fragile and stiff from years of arthritis and a recent fall that had left me bruised and sore. I had come to live with them because I thought family meant care, that a son would be the first to protect and cherish his mother. Instead, I found myself begging for something as basic as warmth, something as simple as a blanket, like a child standing outside in the cold, hoping for a crumb of kindness that never came freely. I am now settled in a small cabin nestled deep in the woods of upstate Michigan, far from the city and the people who made me feel less than human. I live alone, but in this solitude, I have found a peace that eluded me for decades. The cabin is modest, with creaky floorboards and a wood stove that crackles and hums against the cold that sneaks in through the thin walls. Here, I am no longer the invisible burden I was in my son's house. Here, the fire is mine to tend, the heat my own to command. I start my mornings wrapped in a thick quilt, sipping tea as the dawn light filters through frost-covered windows. But the journey to this quiet refuge was not born of choice, but of necessity, a slow unraveling of dignity and love that began with a single humiliating moment, a moment that changed everything. It happened during one of the coldest winters I had ever experienced. The snow piled high outside the windows, the wind howled like a wild beast, clawing at the walls, and the heating system in my son's house was a silent enemy. I had been recovering from a fall, my bones aching, my hands trembling from the chill. One evening, I shivered under a thin blanket in the guest room they had reluctantly offered me, and I dared to ask my son for an extra blanket. The words that left his mouth still haunt me. If you're that cold, ask nicely for the blanket. He said it quickly, barely moving his lips, as if the act of warmth were a privilege I hadn't earned and not a right I deserved. His wife smirked from the kitchen doorway, and the grandkids laughed, their eyes glinting with the cruelty only children learn from grown-ups. I asked, my voice small and careful, and when I finally got the blanket, I felt a hollow victory. It was a gift that came with a price, a reminder that I was not truly welcome, not truly cared for, but tolerated. That moment became the catalyst for everything that followed. The heat in my room was slowly diminished until it was almost non-existent. Vents were turned off, radiators left cold. The warmth was rationed as if I were some outsider whose comfort could be denied. Meals grew smaller, portions passed over without a word. Conversation stopped just before they could touch me. My presence was an inconvenience, a weight I could feel pressing down on my chest every time I entered the living room. They stopped asking if I wanted tea or needed anything. Their voices clipped and hurried whenever they addressed me. I was spoken about, not to, as if I had become a ghost in my own family's home. The children avoided me, the smiles polite but forced, the glances quick and dismissive. Even the television, once a shared comfort, became a symbol of exclusion. I was not allowed to control the remote, not allowed to choose what we watched. I was a spectator to my own erasure. One evening, as I sat shivering on the edge of my bed, wrapped in the threadbare blanket I had begged for, I caught sight of a letter peeking out from beneath my son's papers on the desk. It was an insurance policy, the kind that names beneficiaries in case of death or incapacity. My name was absent. His was the only one printed. It was as if they were preparing for my disappearance, for the moment when I would no longer be a burden or a presence. The realization struck me with a coldness deeper than any winter night. They had already begun to write me out of the story of their lives. That night, with a heavy heart but a clear mind, I searched online and found a listing for a cabin. It was small, rustic, far from the reach of my son's control. The price was reasonable, the location remote but safe. I did not tell anyone of my plan. It was a secret born of desperation and hope. The days that followed were filled with quiet tensions. I asked my son again to turn the heat back on, my voice steady but firm. He replied, "We're trying to conserve energy. You're not the only one here." His words were not cruel, but they cut through me like ice. That same night, I found him in the living room, the heater on full blast, feet propped up on the coffee table, watching television with a content smile. I stood there, shivering, and he looked at me with a mixture of impatience and disdain. "Don't be dramatic," he said. The next morning, after they left for work and school, I took the living room's flat-screen television off the wall. I posted it for sale, cash only, and a buyer came that very afternoon. Selling the television was not an act of spite, but of reclaiming something that belonged to me, the firewood it could buy, the warmth it would provide in my own home. With the money, I purchased cords of seasoned firewood and arranged for a ride to the cabin. I packed my belongings carefully, my medications, a few cherished photographs, and the documents that proved I was more than just a guest in someone else's life. Before I left, I wrote a note for them. "I don't need to beg to be warm." Then I left, alone. No goodbyes, no explanations. Just a door closed softly behind me and a step into the unknown. Now, in this cabin, the nights are still cold, but I control the fire. The flames dance and crackle, casting shadows that are mine alone. I chop the wood myself, feeling the strength in my arms and the steady beat of my heart. I brew my tea over the stove and sit in the silence that is not empty, but full of possibilities. No one watches me. No one tells me when to wrap up or how to behave. I am no longer a subject of pity or neglect, but a woman who holds her own warmth, her own life, and her own story. The pain of the past remains like a shadow, but it no longer defines me. I am here, still standing, still burning bright, a fire that no one can extinguish. That bitter winter evening was the moment when everything changed, the moment when the thin veneer of family care shattered into sharp shards of cold reality. I had been lying in the guest room, the single blanket they grudgingly gave me barely keeping the chill away, my body aching from a recent fall that had left me with bruises and a limp I tried to hide. The house around me buzzed with life, my son and his wife bustling about in the kitchen, the laughter of my grandchildren echoing through the halls, but I was invisible, a ghost wrapped in a threadbare shroud of neglect. I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that they would notice my discomfort and offer something more, a second blanket or a gentle word. But instead, I was met with silence and indifference. When I finally summoned the courage to ask for an extra blanket, the response I received was colder than the air that seeped through the cracked window panes. My son, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, arms folded and eyes narrowed, said in a voice so flat it might have been a command, "If you're that cold, ask nicely for the blanket." The words were delivered not with affection or concern, but with a clipped impatience, as if I were an inconvenience to be tolerated rather than a mother deserving of care. The moment stung far deeper than any winter chill. It was not just the refusal of warmth, but the humiliation of being made to beg for it in front of the family. His wife lingered behind him, a faint smirk playing on her lips, while the children giggled nervously, unsure of where to place their loyalties or how to react to the grown-up tension. I asked, quietly and carefully, my voice betraying my age and vulnerability, and when the blanket was finally handed to me, it felt less like a gift and more like a punishment. I wrapped it tightly around my shoulders, the fabric coarse against my skin, and retreated to my room with a heavy heart. I did not cry then. There was no room for tears in the harsh landscape of rejection that had been laid before me. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, the warmth barely reaching me, and felt the crushing weight of a new truth, that I was no longer welcome here, not truly, not as the mother I once was. In the days that followed, the coldness extended beyond the physical. The heat in my room was turned down until it was almost non-existent. Vents were closed off, radiators left cold, and I found myself shivering beneath layers of clothing and blankets that never quite seemed enough. The household's warmth was carefully rationed, a currency I no longer held. Meals became smaller, portions passed over without acknowledgement or care, as if my presence at the table was a mere formality rather than a necessity. Conversations stopped before they could reach me, voices lowering or shifting topics when I entered a room. I became an afterthought, a shadow that moved silently between walls but never fully belonged. My son and his wife spoke about me as if I were not there, using the third person. She's still asleep. She already ate. Even when I was in the same room, a deliberate erasure of my existence and needs. The children avoided eye contact, their smiles polite but hollow, their laughter nervous and unsure. The home that was supposed to be a sanctuary felt more like a prison, a place where I was tolerated but never truly accepted. The television, once a symbol of family connection and shared moments, became another instrument of exclusion. I was not given the remote, nor was I allowed to choose what we watched. My opinions and preferences were dismissed or ignored, and I was left to watch silently as others filled the space with noise and distraction. The flickering screen mocked me, a cold glow illuminating the distance growing between us. I felt like a stranger in my own family's life, a visitor who had overstayed her welcome. The small daily indignities piled up like snowdrifts around me, each one heavier than the last, until I could barely breathe beneath the weight of neglect and shame. One evening, while tidying the guest room, I noticed a stack of papers on my son's desk, half hidden beneath a pile of magazines and bills. Among them was a letter, its official envelope stark and impersonal. Curiosity and dread compelled me to open it. Inside was an insurance policy, life insurance, naming my son as the sole beneficiary. There was no mention of me, no provision for my care or well-being. The implication was unmistakable. They were preparing for my absence, for the day when I would no longer be a presence in their lives. The cold realization settled over me like a winter frost, seeping into my bones. They had already begun to write me out of the story, to treat me as if I were an inconvenience to be managed rather than a mother to be cherished. I folded the papers carefully, returned them to their place, and sat down to gather my thoughts. The home that once promised warmth and safety had become a place of exile and erasure. That night, I lay awake in the cold, the faint hum of the heater barely audible in the background, and I began to think of a different life, a life where I was not invisible, not a burden, not a guest waiting to be discarded. In the quiet of the dark, I searched online and found a listing for a small cabin, tucked away in the woods of upstate Michigan. It was rustic and simple, but it had a wood stove and the promise of solitude. The price was affordable within my modest means. Without telling anyone, I made inquiries, spoke to the owner, and began to imagine a life where the fire was mine to tend, where the warmth was not something I begged for, but something I created with my own hands. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to stir something inside me that had long lain dormant, a flicker of agency, a whisper of freedom. The days that followed were filled with tension and quiet confrontation. I asked my son again to turn the heat back on in my room, my voice steady but resolute. His response was indifferent and final. "We're trying to conserve energy. You're not the only one here." The words, though practical on the surface, carried an unspoken message of exclusion and dismissal. That night, I found him in the living room, the heater blazing at full strength, feet propped up on the coffee table, eyes glued to the television. I stood in the doorway, shivering, and he looked at me with impatience and disdain. "Don't be dramatic," he said, as if my very presence were a nuisance. The contrast was cruel, the warmth radiating around him, the cold seeping into my bones. It was a moment of clarity, a moment when I understood that the life I had known with my family was no longer mine. With a quiet determination, I took the living room's flat-screen television off the wall the next morning, posting it for sale with a sign that read, "Cash only." The buyer came that afternoon, and I exchanged the television for money that would buy firewood, warmth I could command on my own terms. The sale was not an act of vengeance, but of reclamation, a step toward a life where I was no longer subject to the whims and neglect of those who should have cared for me. I packed my belongings, my medications, cherished photographs, important documents, and wrote a note before I left. "I don't need to beg to be warm." Then I stepped out into the cold, alone but resolute, closing the door softly behind me on the life that had become a prison. This was the catalyst, the moment when I chose to stop waiting for love and care that would never come, and instead began to build a life on my own terms, one firewood log at a time, one step into the cold winter night, leading me toward freedom and self-respect. The days that followed the moment I sold the television and packed my belongings were a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty, a delicate balance between the fear of stepping into the unknown and the deep-seated desire to reclaim a life that had long been denied to me. The air outside was biting cold, and the snow lay thick on the ground, muffling the sounds of the world as if nature itself had grown quiet in sympathy with my own silenced heart. I had arranged for a ride to the cabin I had found online, a modest place nestled deep within the woods of upstate Michigan, far removed from the suburban life I had been forced to abandon. The journey was long and winding, the road slick with ice, and every mile felt like a step further away from a past that had grown heavy with disappointment and neglect. As the cityscape gave way to forests and open fields, I felt a strange lightness, a tentative hope that perhaps here, in the quiet solitude of the woods, I could find something I had lost long ago: warmth, dignity, and the freedom to simply be myself. The cabin itself was small and humble, its weathered wooden walls bearing the marks of many winters, but there was a sturdiness to it that spoke of resilience and endurance, qualities I recognized in myself. Inside, the air was cool but clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke from a previous tenant. The wood stove stood proudly in the corner, a promise of heat and comfort that I knew would become the heart of this new home. I set about unpacking slowly, each object placed carefully in its new place, a quiet ritual that felt like reclaiming not just space, but a part of my identity. The photo albums, the medications, the few cherished belongings I had brought with me, all these things became anchors in the unfamiliar environment. That first night, wrapped in a thick quilt I had brought from the old house, I lay on the narrow bed, and listened to the wind whisper through the trees, a sound so different from the distant traffic and muffled voices I had left behind. It was a solitude that did not feel like loneliness, but like the beginning of something new. In the days that followed, I settled into a routine that was both foreign and healing. Each morning, I would wake early to the soft light filtering through the frosted windows, brew a pot of tea on the stove, and sit by the small kitchen table, watching the smoke curl upwards from the chimney against the pale winter sky. I chopped wood for the fire, feeling the strength in my arms as I lifted the logs and stacked them neatly beside the stove. The physical labor was exhausting, but satisfying in a way I hadn't known in years. Each swing of the axe, a small act of reclamation. Each crackle of the fire, a reminder that I was in control of my own warmth and comfort. The silence of the woods was a balm to my weary soul, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots as I ventured outside for walks along the winding trails near the cabin. These walks became a meditation, a way to breathe in the fresh air and slowly shed the weight of years spent in neglect and invisibility. Despite the peace I found in this new life, there were moments when the old wounds throbbed painfully, memories of the coldness and rejection that had driven me here, pressing insistently against the edges of my consciousness. I remembered the sharpness in my son's voice when he told me to ask nicely for the blanket, the smirks and laughter that had followed, and the cold silence that had enveloped me afterward. There were nights when the cold would seep through even the thickest layers of clothing and blankets, and I would sit close to the stove, hands stretched out toward the fire, feeling both the heat and the ache of loneliness. I was far from the warmth of family gatherings, the chatter of grandchildren, the comfort of familiar faces. Yet, in this distance, I found a strange kind of freedom, the freedom to grieve, to heal, and to rebuild, without the constant reminders of my past invisibility. Slowly, I began to reach out to the small community nearby, a scattering of cabins and homes nestled among the trees. One afternoon, while taking a walk along a snowy lane, I met a woman named Joyce, a widow who lived in a nearby house with her old cat and a garden that seemed to thrive despite the harsh winters. Joyce was gruff but kind, a woman who spoke little but listened well. She welcomed me with a pot of hot soup and a warm smile, a rare gesture that felt like a bridge across the loneliness. We began to share quiet conversations over cups of tea, talking about the changing seasons, the birds that visited her feeders, and the challenges of living in the woods. Joyce did not ask about my past or my son. She simply accepted me as I was, a presence in the cold, a fellow traveler through the winters of life. Her friendship was a lifeline, a reminder that even in isolation, connection was possible. The arrival of my first paycheck from a part-time job at a small cafe in town was a moment of quiet triumph. I had applied for the job not because I needed the money desperately, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I was still capable, still worthy of contributing to the world. The work was hard and unfamiliar, waking early to brew coffee and serve breakfast to a crowd of early risers, but I found solace in the routine and the small interactions that made me feel seen. Heather, the cafe manager, was a woman of few words, but steady kindness, who welcomed me into the rhythm of the mornings without fuss or judgment. With each shift, I grew more confident, the ache in my feet and hands a reminder that I was still alive and fighting. My first paycheck, though modest, was mine alone to spend, a symbol of independence that filled me with a warmth deeper than any fire. One of the first things I did with that money was to buy a coat, not a new one, but a sturdy navy wool coat from a second-hand shop in town. Trying it on in the dusty mirror, I felt a flicker of recognition as if the coat had been waiting for me all along. It was more than just clothing. It was a statement, a reclaiming of my identity and dignity. Walking home through the crisp air, the coat wrapped tightly around me, I felt the weight of years lift, even if only slightly. The coat became my armor against the cold world outside and the colder memories inside. Each day, I added small things to my life: a crossword puzzle book, a box of real tea, a pair of warm socks, simple acts of self-care that were revolutionary in their assertion that I mattered. The isolation of the cabin was punctuated by letters and calls from my family, fragments of a world I had left behind but could not entirely escape. My grandson, Kieran, was the one who reached out most consistently, his letters filled with genuine concern and a longing to reconnect that was unburdened by blame or anger. His voice on the phone was tentative but warm, a bridge between the past and the future. The rest of the family, particularly my son and daughter-in-law, oscillated between attempts at control and bitter silence, their messages a mixture of frustration, guilt, and veiled demands. I did not respond immediately to their pleas or accusations. Instead, I held on to the quiet strength I was building, knowing that my journey was not about reconciliation, but about rediscovery. In the cabin, as the winter deepened and the days grew shorter, I learned to live with the shadows of my past and the flickering light of my new beginning. The fire burned steadily, the woodpile grew, and with each crackle and pop I felt a little more alive. The cold no longer owned me. I owned the cold. This was my home now, imperfect and solitary, but mine. I was no longer a woman who begged for warmth or approval. I was a woman who made her own fire and sat by it in the quiet dignity of reclaimed life. The first escalation was not just the act of leaving, but the slow, steady building of a life that could survive the winter, a life that could hold both pain and hope in its hands and refuse to be broken. As the weeks passed in the quiet embrace of the cabin, I felt a subtle but profound shift within myself, a turning point that marked the middle of my journey from abandonment to self-possession. The initial shock of leaving my son's house and the sting of betrayal had begun to soften, replaced by a growing sense of agency and reflection that took root like a fragile seed breaking through winter's frozen soil. In this new life, surrounded by the towering pines and the endless sky, I discovered the space and silence I needed not only to heal, but to reclaim parts of myself that had been buried under years of neglect and erasure. The cabin, with its creaking floors and wood stove's steady glow, became more than a shelter. It became a sanctuary where I could begin to listen to the quiet voice inside me that had been drowned out for so long. One afternoon, while sitting at the small kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea, I found myself staring out the frost-covered window at the soft blanket of snow covering the landscape. The stillness was broken by the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside, and soon after, a knock at the door. I opened it to find Joyce, my neighbor from down the lane, standing there with a basket of fresh bread and a wary smile. She was a woman of few words, but a steady presence, someone who had quietly watched my arrival and the slow settling of my new life. She didn't ask prying questions or offer unsolicited advice. Instead, she simply stepped inside, placed the bread on the counter, and said, "Thought you might like something fresh. The winter's long and company's scarce." That simple act of kindness, unburdened by expectation, was a balm to my soul. Joyce's friendship became a quiet anchor, a reminder that connection could exist even on my own terms and without the weight of obligation or judgment. Encouraged by this small but meaningful connection, I began to venture beyond the solitude of the cabin and into the nearby town. It was a place of modest shops and familiar faces, a community that seemed to thrive on simplicity and resilience. There, I found work at a small cafe owned by Heather, a woman whose quiet strength and steady kindness made the early mornings bearable. The cafe was humble, with mismatched chairs and the comforting aroma of brewing coffee and fresh pastries. Each morning, I would arrive early to help set up, the routine grounding me and giving my days purpose beyond survival. The work was hard but honest, a chance to prove to myself that I was still capable, still worthy of respect and dignity. Heather didn't ask about my past or pity my age. She treated me like any other capable adult, expecting me to show up and do my best. In this new role, I found a sense of belonging that was not rooted in family ties, but in shared effort and quiet respect. The first paycheck I earned was a small but powerful symbol of my rebirth. With the modest sum in my pocket, I made my way to a secondhand clothing shop, where I chose a navy wool coat with a subtle herringbone pattern. It was not new, but it fit me perfectly, wrapping around me like a promise of warmth and resilience. Trying it on in the dusty mirror, I felt a flicker of recognition, as if the coat had been waiting for me all along, ready to shield me from the cold world outside and the lingering shadows within. That coat became more than just an article of clothing. It was a statement, a reclaiming of identity and dignity. Each time I slipped it on, I felt a little stronger, a little more myself. The simple acts of buying a coat, choosing real tea instead of the dusty bags I had brought from the old house, and carrying a crossword puzzle book in my pocket became rituals of self-care and rebellion against the invisibility I had endured. In the quiet moments between work and solitude, I began to write letters, not to my family who had cast me aside, but to myself. These letters were raw and honest, a dialogue with the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. I acknowledged the pain of rejection and betrayal, the humiliation of begging for a blanket, and the loneliness of being erased from the lives I had once nurtured. But I also celebrated the small victories, the fire I tended, the friendships I nurtured, the independence I reclaimed. Writing these letters was an act of healing and affirmation, a way to hold on to my own story and rewrite it in my own words. It was a slow process, filled with doubts and tears, but each word laid a brick in the foundation of my new life. The midpoint of my journey was marked not by a grand event or dramatic confrontation, but by this quiet turning inward and outward, a reclaiming of agency and a commitment to myself. I was no longer waiting for my son or anyone else to recognize my worth or offer me warmth. Instead, I was learning to provide those things for myself, to build a life that was whole and true to who I was, even if it was different from what I had once known. The pain of exclusion still lingered, but it no longer defined me. In the silence of the woods and the steady glow of the fire, I found a new kind of strength, a strength born not of dependence, but of resilience, not of being seen by others, but of seeing myself. This shift was not without its challenges. There were days when the cold seeped through the cabin walls and into my bones, when loneliness pressed heavy on my chest, and the memories of my son's harsh words and indifferent gaze threatened to overwhelm me. But even in those moments, I held on to the flicker of hope that had brought me here, the belief that I could build a life where warmth was not a gift to be begged for, but a fire to be nurtured within. I began to envision a future where I was no longer a shadow in someone else's home, but the author of my own story, the keeper of my own fire. The midpoint was a quiet revolution, a turning away from the past and a turning toward the possibilities of the present and future. It was the moment I stopped waiting for permission to be warm, to be loved, to be seen, and started giving those things to myself. In the glow of the wood stove and the company of new friendships, I found the courage to step fully into the life I had chosen. Imperfect and solitary, but real and mine. This was the heart of my transformation. The moment when survival became living, and the ember of hope blossomed into a steady flame. The weeks that followed my departure from my son's house were filled with a fragile sense of peace and burgeoning independence. But as with any journey of reclaiming oneself, the past is never far behind. The quiet life I had begun in the cabin was not immune to disruption, and the second escalation, the return of the past in a more direct and pressing form, arrived unexpectedly, testing the strength I had spent so long building. It came in the form of letters, phone calls, and ultimately a visit that shattered the calm I had cultivated, forcing me to confront the tangled emotions and unresolved ties that still bound me to the family I had left. My grandson Kieran was the first to reach out after I left. His letters arrived with a regularity that was both comforting and heartbreaking, filled with genuine concern and a longing for connection that had nothing to do with the conflicts between the adults in our lives. He was the only one who seemed to see me, not as a burden or an afterthought, but as a person who mattered. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, and his words were soft and kind, asking how I was and telling me about his life without judgment or blame. Reading his letters, I felt a warmth that the cabin's wood stove could not provide, a fragile bridge back to the world I had left behind. Yet, even as I treasured these letters, I was cautious. The wounds from my son's rejection were still raw, and I was not ready to reopen that door fully. So I kept my replies brief, choosing when and how to respond on my own terms. In contrast to Kieran's gentle outreach, the messages from my son and daughter-in-law were fraught with tension and unspoken demands. They oscillated between feigned concern and veiled accusations, their words heavy with frustration and control. I received letters filled with guilt-tripping statements about how my disappearance had disrupted family plans, how Lisa cried every night, how the children were confused and hurt by my absence. None of these letters acknowledged the moments of humiliation and neglect that had driven me away. Instead, they painted me as the source of pain, the unreasonable one who had chosen abandonment over love. Their voices echoed with the tired refrain of control masquerading as care, and I refused to engage in their narratives. I was not the antagonist in their story, but their version sought to cast me in that role, and I would not play along. One afternoon, as the winter deepened and the snow piled higher against the cabin walls, a letter arrived that marked a turning point in this second escalation. It was from Lisa, the woman who had once smiled with false warmth as I begged for a blanket, now writing with a tone that was less sharp but no less controlling. She claimed she was not trying to replace me, only to protect the family from the shadow I cast in every room. Her words revealed a complex mix of guilt, fear, and a desire to maintain dominance over the family narrative. Reading her letter, I felt a flicker of something I had not expected, an acknowledgement of the truth, however faint, that I was no longer welcome in their carefully constructed life. It was a confession of sorts, thinly veiled by excuses, but it was there. I folded the letter carefully and placed it aside, not responding, choosing silence over the drama of reconciliation that I knew would only trap me once again. The real challenge came when Lisa appeared in person. I was at the cafe where I worked, a place that had become a refuge and a symbol of my new life, when Heather, the manager, discreetly warned me of a visitor. Lisa stood near the pastry display, her posture stiff and her expression unreadable, as if she were bracing herself for an encounter she both dreaded and needed to have. I did not approach her. Instead, I continued my work, letting her wait in the quiet tension that filled the nearly empty room. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and cautious, asking if we could talk privately. We sat in the back booth, a space that had witnessed many quiet conversations and confessions, and she began to unravel the story of panic and regret that had unfolded since my departure. The flight was boarding, the kids were cranky, and in the chaos they had thought I was behind them, only to realize hours later that I was not on the plane. The excuses spilled out, fragile and insufficient against the backdrop of 8 hours of deliberate abandonment. I listened without interrupting, my gaze steady and calm. When she spoke of Kieran struggling, of Adam's fury, and of the family's willingness to talk only if I was reasonable, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the pressure to conform, to forgive, to return to the role I had long outgrown. But this time I was different. I was no longer the woman who begged for warmth or approval. I was a woman who had built a life on her own terms, who had found strength in solitude and self-respect. I told Lisa that Kieran did not need a go-between, that he knew how to call me himself. She nodded, her eyes briefly meeting mine with a mixture of sadness and resignation, and confessed that she had not tried to replace me, but only to remove my shadow from every room. That admission, stripped of pretense, was the closest thing to honesty I had heard from her in years. After she left, I sat quietly, the weight of the encounter settling over me like the snow outside. Joyce, ever perceptive, asked if I was going to see them again. I shook my head, feeling the finality of my choice. My connection with Kieran was a fragile thread I would nurture, but the ties to the rest of the family were severed by years of neglect and control. I was done waiting for permission to exist on their terms. The pressure intensified when a letter arrived from a regional news outlet back in my old neighborhood. It was a bulky envelope containing a newspaper clipping titled "Missing Matriarch. Family Speaks Out on Grandmother's Disappearance." The article painted a picture of concern and bewilderment, quoting Adam and Lisa, expressing worry for my safety and vulnerability. The photo that accompanied the piece was one taken years ago at a family gathering, a smiling image that felt like a mask hiding the truth beneath. I laughed aloud, a sharp, startled sound that surprised even me. The spectacle of their public worry, the performance of innocence and helplessness, was obscene in its hypocrisy. They acted concerned only when I was no longer useful, when I could no longer fulfill their expectations. I kept the clipping not out of sentiment, but as proof that I was more than a pawn in their drama, proof that I had chosen freedom over subjugation. Heather, at the cafe, noticed the article when it was accidentally left on the counter. She asked softly if I was okay, and I assured her I was better than ever. The new life I had forged was not without its challenges, but it was mine. The connections I made, the work I did, and the fire I tended in my cabin all nourished a sense of self that no letter or visit could extinguish. Then came the visit from the lawyer, Derek Sorensen, who represented Adam and Lisa. He appeared at the cafe one afternoon, his tone polite but firm, inquiring about my well-being and assets. I met his questions with quiet defiance, telling him my well-being was excellent, and my assets were none of their business. When he suggested next steps to ensure I was in a safe environment, I folded my apron and walked past him without hesitation. I was no pet to be controlled or managed. Arthur, my friend who frequented the cafe, waited for me outside and seeing the tension in my eyes, asked if I was okay. I told him I was not going to let anyone convince me otherwise. In the face of mounting pressure, I wrote a final letter, not to my son, not to Lisa, but to their lawyer. It was brief, clear, and resolute. I affirmed that I was of sound mind, in a safe environment, and not under duress. I informed him that I had retained local legal counsel and that any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. This letter was my boundary, my shield against the relentless attempts to control and define me. Meanwhile, my friendship with Arthur deepened. He was a widower, with stories etched into the lines of his face, and a quiet kindness that contrasted sharply with the chaos of my past. We shared moments over cups of tea, conversations about birds, and the small wonders of life, and the unspoken understanding that comes with shared experience and mutual respect. Arthur never pressed me about my past or my family. He simply offered companionship without conditions, a presence that was steady and reassuring. Joyce remained my steadfast ally, her presence a constant in the shifting landscape of my new life. Together, we navigated the seasons, the small joys and challenges of living apart from the world I had left behind. She never asked for explanations or apologies, only offering a glass of wine and a shared silence that spoke volumes. The second escalation was not just a return of the past, but a test of my resolve. It forced me to confront old wounds, to face the lingering ties that bound me to a family that had rejected me. But it also affirmed the strength I had found in choosing myself, in building a life that was true to who I was, rather than who others expected me to be. I was no longer a shadow or a burden. I was a woman who had reclaimed her dignity and her story. In the quiet aftermath of this escalation, I sat by the fire in my cabin, the flames flickering like the steady beat of my heart. The cold outside was relentless, but inside I was warm with the knowledge that I had chosen freedom over submission, that I had made my own fire and was tending it with care and courage. This was not the end of my journey, but it was a milestone, a moment of clarity and strength that would carry me forward into whatever came next. The moment I sent the letters, the ones I had been drafting quietly in the sanctuary of my cabin, felt like releasing a held breath I didn't know I was keeping. The first was addressed to Lisa, the woman who had so coldly witnessed my humiliation and carried it on her shoulders as if it were some sort of shield for the family's fragile facade. My words were measured, sharp but calm. 3 simple lines that carried the weight of years of pain and finality. I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I signed it with a steady hand and sealed it with a stamp that bore the image of a finch, a small bird that sings even in the coldest seasons. It was not a letter of forgiveness, nor was it a plea for reconciliation. It was a declaration of independence, a line drawn in the snow that I would not cross again. I mailed it the next morning, knowing full well that it would not be received with open arms, but confident that I had finally reclaimed my voice. The second letter was addressed to Derek Sorensen, the lawyer who had come to the cafe with polished words and veiled threats disguised as concern. This letter was formal and unyielding, a legal fortress erected with carefully chosen words. To whom it may concern, it began, there is no cause for further legal contact. I am of sound mind in a safe environment and not under duress. I have retained local legal counsel. Any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern will be considered harassment. I signed this letter with the same firmness, feeling the strength of finality in every stroke of the pen. Sending it was an act of defiance and self-protection, an assertion that I was no longer subject to manipulation or control. It was the last cut, the severing of all the tangled threads that had bound me to a past I was determined to leave behind. In the days that followed, the weight of these actions settled over me like a heavy but cleansing snowfall. I continued my routine in the cabin, tending the fire and brewing my tea, but there was a new lightness in my step, a subtle but profound shift in my spirit. The fire burned steady and warm, a symbol of the power I held in my own hands. I was no longer a passive recipient of warmth or care. I was the source of my own comfort and dignity. This newfound agency was not without its moments of doubt or loneliness, but it was a path I had chosen deliberately, with eyes wide open and heart steady. The silence that followed the letters was not empty, but filled with possibility. My phone, which I had kept off for so long, began to buzz with messages and missed calls. Lisa's voice was frantic in the earliest messages, filled with pleas and accusations that I chose not to answer. Adam's tone was curt and impatient, a reflection of frustration and helplessness that no longer held power over me. The family's attempts to draw me back into their orbit were met with calm refusal. I did not respond. I was not ready to reopen wounds or engage in battles that served only to diminish my hard-won peace. Instead, I focused on the life I had built, the steady rhythms of work at the cafe, the warmth of the fire, the quiet companionship of Joyce and Arthur. It was during this time that Lisa, perhaps recognizing that letters and messages were not enough, chose to appear in person at the cafe. Heather spotted her first, a woman in a tailored coat, standing stiffly by the pastry display, pretending to read the chalkboard menu, but clearly waiting for me. The cafe, usually a place of refuge, became a stage for a confrontation I had long anticipated, but hoped to avoid. I did not approach her. I let her wait, letting the weight of silence fill the space between us. When she finally asked to talk privately, I led her to the back booth, the same one where we had first spoken after my departure. Lisa's words were a mix of apology and justification. She spoke of panic and regret, of the chaos that had accompanied the flight, and the mistaken belief that I was behind them. She admitted fear and confusion, the pressure to maintain the family's image, and the strain of managing children who were too young to understand the full story. Yet beneath the surface, there was a rawness, a glimpse of vulnerability that I had not expected. When she confessed that she had not intended to replace me, but only to remove my shadow from their lives, I saw not the woman who had mocked me, but a person trapped in her own web of fear and control. I told her that I was not her shadow, that I was my own person who had finally remembered how to be myself. The words hung in the air, heavy and true, and she left without finishing her coffee, the silence between us speaking volumes. That night, sitting by the fire in my cabin, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, the betrayal, the humiliation, the slow and steady rebuilding of my life. The letters I had sent were not just messages to others. They were declarations to myself, affirmations of worth and boundaries that I would no longer allow to be crossed. I was no longer waiting for permission to be warm, to be seen, to be loved. I had taken those gifts into my own hands, kindling a fire that no one else could extinguish. The final cut came quietly, but with undeniable power. It was not a dramatic confrontation or a fiery speech, but the steady, unyielding assertion of my right to exist on my own terms. I was done waiting for others to recognize my value. I was done begging for warmth or approval. I was a woman who had made her own fire, who tended it with care and courage, and who would not be moved. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. I continued to work at the cafe, the familiar routine grounding me and connecting me to the world beyond the woods. Heather and I shared quiet moments of companionship, and Arthur's visits brought a steady warmth that complemented the fire in my stove. Joyce remained a steadfast presence, her friendship a balm for the lingering ache of isolation. Together, we navigated the changing seasons, finding joy in small pleasures and strength in shared silence. The phone calls and letters from my family became less frequent, their urgency fading into a resigned acceptance that I was not returning. I held on to my connection with Kieran, nurturing that fragile thread with care and hope. Our conversations were simple but meaningful, a reminder that some bonds could survive even the deepest fractures. One evening, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the trees, I penned a final letter, not to my family, not to the lawyer, but to myself. It was a letter of love and affirmation, a reminder of the journey I had undertaken and the woman I had become. "Dear me," I wrote, "you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back. Look at the life that opened. Well done." I tucked the letter inside the drawer of my dresser, a secret talisman to revisit when doubt crept in, or the shadows of the past grew long. This moment of culmination was not an ending, but a beginning, a turning point where I stepped fully into the life I had chosen, free from the chains of the past and empowered by the fire I tended within. It was a victory born not of vengeance or anger, but of quiet strength and unwavering self-respect. In the glow of the wood stove and the embrace of the night, I found peace, a peace that comes from knowing you have reclaimed yourself and will never be diminished again. The winter light outside my cabin softened as the days slowly lengthened, the promise of spring whispering through the thinning frost on the windows. Inside, the steady warmth of the fire stove kept the chill at bay, and with it came a calm that I had not known for years. The journey that began with humiliation and neglect had brought me here, to a place not just of solitude, but of peace and quiet dignity. I sat in my favorite chair, wrapped in the navy wool coat I had purchased with my own hard-earned money, feeling the weight of the past lift little by little. The memories of the cold nights at my son's house, the bitter words, and the isolation still lingered like shadows at the edges of my mind, but they no longer held power over me. They were chapters in a story I had survived and rewritten on my own terms. This cabin, with its worn wooden walls and the constant crackle of the fire, had become more than a refuge. It was a testament to resilience and the reclaiming of self. Each log I chopped and stacked was a step toward freedom. Each cup of tea brewed on the stove, a small act of self-care and defiance against the years of invisibility I had endured. I had learned to listen to the quiet voice inside me that spoke of strength and worth, a voice that no longer trembled with fear or begged for recognition. I was whole in my solitude, connected to the rhythms of the natural world and the steady heartbeat of my own courage. The relationships I nurtured in this new life, Joyce's steadfast friendship, Arthur's quiet companionship, and the tentative but precious connection with my grandson Kieran, were threads of light that wove through the fabric of my days. They reminded me that while I had left behind a family that had rejected me, I had not left behind all possibility for connection and love. These bonds, free from control and expectation, nourished my spirit and kept the loneliness at bay. They were proof that even after betrayal, there was room for kindness and understanding in the world. I often thought of the letter I had written to myself, tucked away in the drawer, a talisman of affirmation and hope. I would sometimes read it aloud by the fire, letting the words settle deep within me. You waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back. Look at the life that opened. Well done. Those words were not just a reminder of what I had endured, but a celebration of what I had become. A woman who had faced darkness and found her own light. Looking back, I understood that the pain I had suffered was a harsh but necessary passage, a crucible that forged a new kind of strength within me. The cold nights when I begged for a blanket had been the beginning of a long journey through rejection, invisibility, and erasure. But they were also the catalyst for a transformation that led me to a life where I no longer needed to ask for warmth or permission to exist. I had learned that true warmth comes from within, from the fire we kindle in our own hearts and tend with care and courage. To any woman who finds herself invisible, humiliated, or forgotten in the places where she once expected love, I say this: you are not alone and you are not powerless. The path out of that cold darkness is hard and often lonely, but it is there. There is a fire inside you waiting to be lit, a strength waiting to be claimed. You do not have to wait for others to grant you warmth or dignity. You can take it for yourself. Leave the places that make you beg for what should be given freely. Find your own firewood, your own shelter, your own voice. Tend your fire and let it light the way forward. As the seasons turn and the snow melts into the soil, I sit by my fire and watch the flames dance, knowing that I have reclaimed not just a place to live, but a life worth living. I am no longer the woman who begged for a blanket. I am the woman who sold a television to buy firewood and walked away from a house that made her cold. And in that act, I found my warmth, my dignity, and my peace. This is not the end of my story, but a new beginning. One written with strength and quiet joy, a life lived fully on my own terms. The fire in my stove burns steady and bright, a constant reminder that even in the deepest cold, there is always a way to find warmth again.